another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Wednesdays this year, I've been talking to you guys about Jack the Ripper, perhaps the world's most famous unsolved murder mystery. Jack the Ripper was a serial killer who operated in England in 1888, and whatever happened before or after that is still part of the mystery. The first crime that has been more or less confirmed to have been Jack the Ripper occurred on August 31st of that year, and it was the murder of Polly Nichols. The Ripper would strike again on September 8th of 1888 and attack Annie Chapman, and then there was the double event where two women were murdered on the same night on September 30th, and they were Liz Stride and Catherine Eddowes, and the final crime was on November 9th with the murder of Mary Kelly, the Ripper's most heinous act. In this episode, I will be discussing the book Jack the Ripper, the Works of Francis Thompson. Now, some of you may have remembered that I've discussed this Ripper suspect on the channel before. This is actually the fourth episode that I've done on Francis Thompson, because there are several different sources out there. Firstly, I have an episode called Jack the Ripper Suspect Francis Thompson, and there is another book out that talks about this Ripper suspect, and it's called Jack the Poet, Was Francis Thompson Jack the Ripper? And I have a two-part episode where I read the book by Simon Webb of that title, and I did my response. And in this one, I will be looking at Richard Patterson's book. I first learned about Francis Thompson because in 2023, somebody sent me an interview that Richard Patterson had done with the Jack the Ripper Tour YouTube channel. And because I've done a direct response to Simon Webb's book about Francis Thompson as a Jack the Ripper suspect, I really want this one to focus and concentrate on the observations that Richard Patterson has in his book, so it is some different information for the channel. Francis Thompson is more famous for being a poet, and Richard Patterson starts out by saying that a lot of people believe that Jack the Ripper couldn't have been somebody who was a man of letters, that Jack the Ripper couldn't have been a poet, that serial killers are not poets. People have this type of misconception about serial killers that perhaps they're cold and unsophisticated individuals who don't think too much. But when I was reading that in the book, immediately I thought about several examples of serial killers who also were either fascinated by poetry or wrote poetry themselves. The first one that came to mind was Dennis Rader, BTK, and the second one was the Zodiac Killer. Even if he's not using his own compositions, he still would frequently quote The Mikado by Gilbert and Sullivan. And believe it or not, Richard Patterson does use those examples later on in the book, Jack the Ripper, the Works of Francis Thompson, listing off the Zodiac and BTK as two examples of serial killers who were fascinated by poetry. I first went into this suspect profile very pessimistically. I was very pessimistic, hearing about how, well, there are these guys out there like Simon Webb and Richard Patterson who believe that Francis Thompson was Jack the Ripper, yet they're going to be looking at interpretations of his poetry, and just, I didn't necessarily think that this was going to go anywhere. But even after watching the first interview that Richard Patterson did on Francis Thompson, I was like, wow, I was very impressed. And because a lot of the elements that Francis Thompson experienced in his life are quite similar to that of other serial killers. Francis Thompson was from Lancashire in England, and he spent a lot of his childhood in Preston as well as in Ashton-under-Lyne. And he was someone who went on to become a very bright student, a very well-behaved student, and he was fascinated by languages. And by the time he was a young adult, he was fluent in classical Greek, as well as excelling in Latin, but English, of course, would have been one of his strong suits. Francis Thompson was somebody who experienced some very bizarre things in his childhood. One thing that's mentioned in the book, Jack the Ripper, the Works of Francis Thompson, is he was actually a childhood friend of James Kelly, who goes on to become a Jack the Ripper suspect himself. James Kelly is the subject of the book Prisoner 1167, and he is the man who went to Broadmoor Asylum, and then he escaped from Broadmoor Asylum, and then over 20 years later, he returned to spend his final living years back in Broadmoor. James Kelly is a rather interesting suspect in his own right, but for this episode, I would like to focus a little bit more on Francis Thompson. Some things that I haven't mentioned about him on the channel before are that Francis Thompson seemed to have a problem with either pyromania or starting fires as a kid. And another thing that Richard Patterson points out in his book is that on the night of the first murder, the night of the murder of Polly Nichols, there were two suspicious fires that took place. And There were two suspicious fires that took place in London. One was at the Spirit Quay, and the second one was at the dry docks of Shetford. I hope I've got that one right, just going off of memory. But in the terms of the Ripper's activities, those could be purely coincidental, and I think that is more or less left open to the reader. That could this be something that is was intentionally done by Francis Thompson, or was this also something that was just a pure coincidence? Now, in terms of starting fires, this is connected to a certain type of serial killer behavior that is found in the McDonald Triad. The McDonald Triad is the proposition that there are three common behaviors that are experienced by children who go on to become serial killers. One is starting fires, one is harming animals, and the third is actually bedwetting. By the way, some people are here in the live chat. We have Lacey. Good morning, Lacey. And we have William Kane. And then William Kane is here. Thank you so much for tuning in to Black Box Online Radio's Ripper Wednesday. But the other points about Francis Thompson is that he seems like somebody who really struggled to adapt to the challenges of adulthood. And he also is somebody who was not exactly ever able to truly form strong social relationships. And in the book, Jack the Ripper, The Works of Francis Thompson, there are three real propositions about this, about Francis Thompson's behavior. Number one, he could have been a psychopath. Number two, he could have been a schizophrenic. And number three, he may have been the most innocent man in the world. Because the stuff that I've shared before on the channel is that when he would go to the school, he would like to hide in the library, and he would surround himself with books and make little forts out of the books. And maybe I'm projecting too much of my own personal experiences on this, but I think that somebody like him, who really struggled to find employment in his adult years, probably used thinking as a refuge, and also nothing could rival that experience. Getting lost in his imagination, getting lost in his own creativity, daydreaming was probably very euphoric as well as comforting for him. So by the time he gets to adulthood, he tries to join the army and he's a failed soldier. He tries to become a priest. That doesn't work out either. He tries to become a medical doctor, has 6 years of medical education. That also doesn't work out. And he is frequently referred to as a failed priest and a failed doctor. But how does this all tie into Jack the Ripper? It all comes back to the concepts of psychological profiling as well as somebody who would have had anatomical knowledge. Because Jack the Ripper wasn't only a serial killer. He didn't only murder the women that I listed off at the beginning of the episode. He also disemboweled and mutilated them and even removed specific organs. And both Simon Webb and Richard Patterson were not the first people to talk about Francis Thompson as a Jack the Ripper suspect. There is an essay that is included at the beginning of the book that tells the story of Dr. Joe Rupp, who wrote the first article about Francis Thompson as a Ripper suspect that was published back in 1988. And this one talks about how, as I said, Dr. Joe Rupp, as a medical doctor, he was just looking at the Ripper story and thinking, wow, I mean, how on earth was the Ripper able to remove specific organs from some of the victims outside in near total darkness with time limits, with the time constraints? And this seems like somebody who was either a doctor, a medical person, or perhaps he was somebody who had some types of intense familiarity with the human body. And somebody like Francis Thompson, as a former medical student, would have. And Francis Thompson then would even go on to be more or less what's called a serial job hopper. The thing that I've talked about before on the channel is that he became a quality control inspector for medical instruments, like inspecting things like scalpels and so on at a factory where they were made. But some of the other jobs that he had in his lifetime were working as a shoe shiner outside of a shop, and even had a small run-in with the law because he was blocking the business of the shopkeeper. So he got in trouble with the authorities, and that is also consistent with the activities and behaviors of serial killers, about how there can be small arrests that are mounting and compiling before they actually commit murder. Next, he was more or less a porter, a luggage porter, who would carry suitcases for people and ask for tips. And it just seemed like he was somebody who didn't necessarily care too much about his employment, because he was just trying to do whatever he could to get by. He didn't really have any type of real desire to hold down a strong occupation, perhaps because he was just so fascinated and pulled into the world of his own imagination. So Francis Thompson then goes on to become a homeless man for a period of time, and he even got to the point where his clothes would turn into rags, and he just appeared to have lived outside and became very disheveled and was a vagrant. Sometimes maybe you could even use the term vagabond, and this becomes important because he's doing this in London. How was Jack the Ripper able to commit these crimes where he is mutilating and cutting women's bodies apart and get away so quickly? People formulate all types of responses and theories as to how and why Jack the Ripper could have done this. Somebody like Francis Thompson, who would have lived on the streets for a period of time, would have been very familiar with back alleys in London, ways to just get in and out of the crime scene without being noticed, the shortcuts, the holes in the wall, someone who would have had this type of intense familiarity. So you have all of these elements coming into place. Childhood with starting fires. You have somebody who was a gifted underperformer in life. He goes on to become a famous poet, more or less, as well as becoming a writer in his living years. But he also is somebody who had familiarity with London, familiarity with anatomy and surgical skills to a certain extent. And this is one of the reasons why I got more curious about Francis Thompson as a Jack the Ripper suspect. And as I said, this is the 4th episode that I've done on him, so you can see that there's a little bit of natural curiosity. However, this is a point when I also have to say, just because I am curious about a suspect, doesn't mean that he was Jack the Ripper. Did he actually commit the murders or not? At the same time, though, I found that the top 2 suspects that I just read about on my own time the most would be Francis Thompson, and the number 1 suspect would be Dr. Alexander Petachenko. I absolutely do not think that Dr. Alexander Petachenko was Jack the Ripper, but I am somewhat pulled into the story. And in all seriousness, for a while, Francis Thompson was in my top 2 Jack the Ripper suspect tier, but I was watching an interview once with Richard Patterson, and he made some comments that allowed me to lower Francis Thompson. And my top 4 Jack the Ripper suspects, in no particular order, would be Charles Lechmere, Aaron Kosminski, Joseph Barnett, and Jacob Levy. Maybe Francis Thompson would be number 5. However, I think that there are some reasons for this. The reason why he came down on the suspect list is, when I was watching that interview with Richard Patterson, he stated that Francis Thompson was a Catholic. He grew up a Catholic, he tried to become a Catholic priest, and he would have been a deeply religious man. And the women who were the victims of Jack the Ripper were either prostitutes or they were assumed to have been prostitutes. Let's just use those terms because some people dispute that. There's a famous book and podcast out there called The Five, which disputes all of that. But Francis Thompson would have targeted them because he was offended by prostitution because of his deep religious beliefs. And I was just thinking, whoa, wait a second. How on earth does that make any sense? This guy is offended by prostitution because it goes against his Catholic beliefs. So what does he do? He murders people? Well, doesn't that go against Catholic beliefs and traditions as well? I was like, how on earth does this get reconciled? And I'll share another point about that in a second. But when I read Simon Webb's book, it talks about how when Francis Thompson was a kid, he experienced the Ashton riots when he would have only been about 8, 9, or 10 years old, thereabouts. And the Ashton riots dealt with religious persecution of Protestants and Catholics. It's religious conflict. And this is one where he was exposed to violence in the name of a religion. And when I was reading Richard Patterson's book, he talks about this in the beginning by saying that even if he's making comments about Catholicism and talking about how Francis Thompson would have had this belief system, Richard Patterson believes that it would have been something that was created purely in the mind of Francis Thompson. And I'm tempted to use the word perversion. It's a perverted form of Catholicism that only Francis Thompson would have believed if he were indeed Jack the Ripper. And what Richard Patterson was trying to say is, if he talks about anything about Francis Thompson committing crimes in the name of religion, he is not talking about real Catholic beliefs. He would be talking about Francis Thompson's own personal view of it. And that's a little bit easier for me to accept. Somebody who is not only committing these crimes because he's offended by prostitution, but just the whole concept of violence in the name of something that he believes in, because there are other stories of religious violence that could have affected Francis Thompson. He was not named for St. Francis, actually. He was named for a crusader, a knight who had the name Francis, but the story of St. Francis is discussed in the book Jack the Ripper, The Works of Francis Thompson. And St. Francis of Assisi was the first person to experience stigmata. And I want to say that was in 1224 CE, and then he goes on to pass away in 1226. And stigmata is often associated with the holes in your hands after Jesus gets nailed to the cross, if somebody were to actually have those. But I was watching a documentary that was based on Donald Soto's book called The Reluctant Saint about St. Francis of Assisi. And it actually states that in the process of stigmata, he would have received 5 wounds that Jesus received on the cross. But that's just another example of how and why there could be violence and bloodshed in the name of religion that could have inspired somebody to commit these crimes. Okay, so you've heard all this stuff about medical knowledge. You've heard all these things about how he lived in the area, familiar with the back alleys of London. Well, so what? I mean, just because somebody failed out of medical school and they lived in London, that doesn't mean that they were Jack the Ripper. Firstly, Richard Grinnell is here. Hey, Richard Grinnell, how are you doing? I'm doing just fine, and I hope you're doing well too. But with Francis Thompson, there is a motive that is established. He is somebody who mostly was disconnected from social groups throughout his lifetime, but in 1887, he begins to develop a relationship with a prostitute. Again, offended by prostitution because of his Catholic beliefs, yet he does get into a relationship with a woman who is a prostitute. And the reason why I'm just calling her that is we do not know her name. She is unnamed. She's as much of a mystery as Jack the Ripper. But Francis Thompson had a failed relationship with this woman, but he apparently thought about her very much throughout his lifetime, because Francis Thompson goes on to become a famous poet. His journals are examined. His letters that he mailed to people are examined. And again, this is in 1887 when he has this affair. And it was even remarked by one of his biographers in 1965 saying, well, 1887, that's right before Jack the Ripper, and he has this affair with a woman who was working as a prostitute, and then Jack the Ripper's Autumn of Terror happens in 1888. Isn't that just a shocking coincidence? So you could imagine somebody who is either experiencing some type of heartbreak, someone who's experiencing a certain type of rejection, and then experiencing some type of emotional misery because he had a falling out with this woman. Let's just call her that, this woman, because again, I don't know her name. So he starts roaming the streets of London, and during the Autumn of Terror is when he begins targeting victims. Another point that is discussed in the book, Jack the Ripper, The Works of Francis Thompson, is that Francis Thompson would have been somebody who, let's just say, Jack the Ripper would have been somebody who would have had a lot of easier access to murder victims on the night of August 31st. Because prior to August 31st, there was the murder of Martha Tabram in early August of 1888. And there was a big response to that. There was like a vigilance council and committee that was formed, and people are going on patrols. But no matter what, even if people were being more careful, way more people would have been out on the streets. Way more women would have been out late at night because they weren't afraid of the Ripper yet. August 31st of 1888, nobody knew who Jack the Ripper was. The letters had not been mailed, and this is also something that would have put victims like Polly Nichols and ultimately Annie Chapman in vulnerable places. So some guy who is just really, really heartbroken and devastated and has been internalizing his rage and emotions for months is roaming about the streets, and he would have had much easier access to attack Polly Nichols and Annie Chapman. And then there, even with fear in the air, people like Liz Stride and Catherine Eddowes would have still been out and about. Now, this brings us to the next point in the evidence for Francis Thompson being Jack the Ripper. He was also a drug addict, particularly on opium, but he even attempts suicide once, and he sees this vision of another writer who talks him out of it, and he's more or less hallucinating and high on drugs. But if you Google Francis Thompson, you'll see that in addition to being a famous poet, he was also an opium addict. And I would suspect that he may have done cocaine, but that's just a guess on my part. So all of these elements came into play about somebody who was withdrawn from society, who is emotionally disconnected, socially awkward, starting fires as a kid. And here's another point that I read in the book, Jack the Ripper, The Works of Francis Thompson, is that when Francis Thompson was growing up, he would play with dolls, but in very bizarre manners, almost in ways when he was mutilating or disfiguring the dolls. I haven't seen these things with my own eyes, and I'm always a little bit skeptical about how and why he would have done that. But that seemed, when you put it all together in the full package, it starts to make a little bit of sense. And there's another interesting coincidence that is remarked upon by Richard Patterson in the book, and that is that the first victim of Jack the Ripper was named Mary Ann Nichols, but we refer to her as Polly Nichols because that was her nickname, and Polly was the nickname. But Francis Thompson actually had a sister named Mary Thompson, and her nickname was Polly. But even Richard Patterson chalks that up to most likely being a coincidence. So this is somebody who is just emotionally disconnected from society. Then the chance that he has to form some type of emotional and romantic bond with a woman who is a prostitute, which he perhaps shouldn't have even tried, sets him off in a very destructive way that could have ultimately led to him becoming Jack the Ripper. Now, at this point, we have talked about the first 4 Ripper crimes. The final crime was the murder of Mary Kelly, which is perhaps Jack the Ripper's most famous crime. Mary Kelly was very extensively mutilated. Her heart was cut out and taken, her uterus was cut out, and her intestines were removed and left on a bedside table. And she was only recognized by her eyes and her ears. And the person who identified her was actually Joseph Barnett, the other Jack the Ripper suspect that I talked about at the beginning. But with Francis Thompson, according to his letters, he lived in a building that would have only been a 2-minute walk away from the area on 13 Miller's Court where Mary Kelly was murdered on November 9th of 1888. In the book, Jack the Ripper, The Works of Francis Thompson, it states that it was a 2-minute walk. So that's a connection to a crime scene. In some other sources, like I said, I read Simon Webb's book, and I've heard some interviews on Jack the Ripper tour. I don't remember the exact place where I read this, but it said that it was 80 yards away. The building where Francis Thompson was staying was 80 yards away at the time of the murder of Mary Kelly. Now, there's this thing that's almost speculated or postulated, hypothesized, that was Mary Kelly the woman that Francis Thompson had this affair with, and he fell in love with her and she's the target of the whole thing. I can't even begin to put a label on that because, well, I don't know. We have no idea who this woman was that he was having the affair with. But yeah, I get curious about things of that nature. So this could mean that he has a connection to one of the crime scenes. And also from his letters, again, in the book, Jack the Ripper, The Works of Francis Thompson, it states that he regularly carried a knife on him. And I mean, I'm citing Richard Patterson for all of this. Now, you guys might be thinking, all right, well, we get what you're saying, but was he really Jack the Ripper? I don't know. And one of you guys wrote this out in the comments section here on Black Box Online Radio, that a lot of the evidence for certain suspects exists in profiling. But where's the hard evidence? Think about some of the suspects that I've talked to you about at the beginning. We had people like Jacob Levy, Joseph Barnett, and Francis Thompson. Everything that I've talked to you about has been profiling, mostly psychological profiling. But in terms of living or staying near the location of Mary Kelly's murder, that's a little bit more. That might be geographic profiling, but that's still profiling all the same. Where exactly would be the hard evidence to connect him to, well, any of these crimes? And I think that's why it's ultimately an unsolved case. Most of the suspects do not have hard evidence to connect them to all of the crimes. Now, some people out there, such as Russell Edwards, believe that they have the DNA of Jack the Ripper, and it points to a different suspect called Aaron Kosminski. And I'm hoping to do a much larger presentation on the DNA for Ripper Wednesday. But I would also like to ask you guys, are there any Jack the Ripper suspects that you are curious about? Is there anyone that you would like to hear about on Ripper Wednesday? But there are some other ways that you can help Black Box Online Radio. And in addition to providing ideas for future episodes, you can hit the like button and subscribe. That really helps out the channel. And Every Monday, I do a segment about the Zodiac Killer called Zodiac Monday, and on Fridays, I do a segment about D.B. Cooper. For the summer, I'm trying to go live on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, but Tuesdays and Thursdays, but this Thursday, I'm going to be doing a special bonus episode on the disappearance of the Yuba County Five, and I will be responding to Tony Wright's book. So I just like going live, so I wanted to go live twice a week because it's in my nature now, it's in my habit, and I love just talking to you guys about these stories, even if they are dealing with some very dark and tragic material. But if you have any ideas for future episodes of Ripper Wednesday, please put them in the comment section down below. I would love to read them. Now, as far as Francis Thompson and his observations in life, he was a very intelligent man. And another thing that's included in this book is that he would have been very critical of the Masons, the Freemasons. And later on in his life, he even goes on to talk about the hidden evil history that is associated with the Freemasons. As I said, this guy is a famous writer and so on. Reasonably famous. I had actually never heard of Francis Thompson until the Jack the Ripper days. But he goes to write on this evil history of the Freemasons, the hidden evil history. And again, I'm just thinking now, wait a second. This guy was Jack the Ripper, and then he thinks the Freemasons are evil. And Lacey has a question. Did you look into the case of Jeffrey MacDonald? Yes, I did, actually. He seems like someone who was convicted for murder, but a lot of people believe that he was not actually guilty of murder. And Lacey, I'm going to use that as a future episode next week. I'm going to devote one of the live streams here on True Crime Talk Radio for the Jeffrey MacDonald case. And I'll put I want to do that on the Tuesday show, actually. Lacey has made a couple requests about that, and I have a bigger presentation planned on the story of Jeffrey MacDonald. Yes, when I go live on Tuesdays and Thursdays, it's called True Crime Talk Radio in the morning, and you can hang out with the Fox if you so choose. But as far as Francis Thompson goes, I mean, it's like, you're going to think the Freemasons are evil and be Jack the Ripper mutilating women and pulling out their organs. That's some hard stuff for me to grasp and digest. And I know that the psychological profile they're trying to create, by they, I mean Richard Patterson and Simon Webb and Joe Rupp, would be that he was deranged and he was demented, and this would be somebody who has a twisted way of thinking, like he's doing a good thing, but in all reality, he was perhaps just doing things that were very self-serving. I know that that's the angle that they're going at, but I still have some problems getting it down. The Masons actually have some very large connections to the Jack the Ripper case. And when I was reading Richard Patterson's book, there is even a line about how Freemasons were involved in the Ripper case. And I was just like kind of doing a double take. And I was like, Freemasons were involved with the Ripper case? I was like, you know, you're not stating that as a theory, you're stating that as a fact. I mean, doesn't that kind of go against your own theory? But wait, what Richard Patterson was trying to convey is that there were people who were involved with the investigations that were known and reported Freemasons, most notably Sir Charles Warren, who was head of the police. And he even writes about how George Lusk was a Freemason. George Lusk was the head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, and George Lusk goes on to become the recipient of the From Hell letter that contained a portion of a kidney, half a kidney that was placed in a cardboard box associated with the From Hell letter. Now, I have some strong stances about the letters because I've been talking about them here on Ripper Wednesday for a while, and some observations about them are that there are three main letters that have been attributed to Jack the Ripper that are given strong consideration as to have actually been coming from the killer. Number one, the Dear Boss letter, which is the debut letter, which talks about how Jack the Ripper murdered these women, and he's writing this taunting letter that's mailed to the Central News Agency, and it's signed with one line that did give me some chills that ran down my spine and says that they now think I'm a doctor, or they think I'm a doctor now. But it is signed Jack the Ripper. That was mailed to the Central News Agency. The second is the Saucy Jackie postcard, which is a follow-up after the double event. And the reason why we refer to it as the double event, the murders of Liz Stride and Catherine Eddowes in one night, is because the Saucy Jackie postcard refers to it that way. It's called Double Event this time. And then the third one is the From Hell letter, which was mailed to George Lusk, again the chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, containing what appeared to have been, well, let's just say it was half of a kidney. Now, was that actually from the victim? That appears to be uncertain. You know, it's possible. If any letter is authentic, I would say that it's the From Hell letter. But as of now, I don't believe that the Ripper wrote any of those letters. And it sounds like, from reading the book Jack the Ripper, The Works of Francis Thompson, that Richard Patterson is not 100% convinced that the Ripper wrote any of those letters, but he strongly entertains the possibility. He talks about how Francis Thompson would have written in a similar writing style, and he would have used similar types of paper, similar types of calligraphy and handwriting. He would have been very familiar with all of that stuff, as well as the From Hell letter could have also been using some intentional distractions like odd misspellings and, again, his disliking of the Freemasons. But overall, I don't believe that the Ripper wrote those letters. Number one, the first two are mailed to the Central News Agency. And in the book, Jack the Ripper, The Works of Francis Thompson, it even tells the story of a man named Thomas Bowling being one of the first people to read the Dear Boss letter, the one that I was talking about. And that states, well, it's just that Thomas Bowling goes on to become one of the suspects for fabricating and hoaxing the Dear Boss letter. And the other main suspect for fabricating or hoaxing that one is Frederick Best, who was a reporter and journalist for The Star. The Star was a publication that might have been about to go out of business, and according to an alleged confession in 1931, Frederick Best admitted to fabricating the Dear Boss letter and the Saucy Jackie postcard, which have very similar handwriting, handprinting, and word choice compared to that of the From Hell letter. And then this is mailed in. Those two are mailed to the Central News Agency, and the From Hell letter is mailed to the chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. But I don't think any of those were written by the killer. I think that those three letters are hoaxes, as well as all of the other Jack the Ripper letters. But at this time, I would like to really just kind of ask the audience once again about what you think about Francis Thompson as a Jack the Ripper suspect. And what do you think about this concept of having a disliking toward Freemasons and thinking that they're evil, and just using that as a justification for any of these actions that he would have done? Now, there's another book out there that is called Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution by Stephen Knight, which is discussed in the book by Richard Patterson, and it talks about how there's this theory that the reason why the Ripper murders took place is it involved a conspiracy among the Freemasons and the royal family. And it sounds like Richard Patterson, I mean, you can't say that he's taking any ideas from that book if he is citing it. Maybe you could say he's referencing the book, and he's definitely not stealing anything. But I would really like to know how much of an influence that book had on the foundation of his Ripper-based persona. One thing, though, that is discussed in the book that appears to be a citation from Stephen Knight is, as previously stated, Sir Charles Warren was a Mason, and he resigns from the police force on November 8th of 1888, and he blames the Ripper. He says that that's what's forcing him out. Then on November 9th of 1888, you have the murder of Mary Kelly. And this is an example of just, is this a coincidence, or was this a specific event that was meant to send a message to the Masons, or meant to send a message to somebody in some way, somehow? Was there some type of significance that would have been there? Because there's another book out there that is called They All Loved Jack, Busting the Ripper by Bruce Robinson, which talks about a Jack Ripper suspect named Michael Maybrick. And Bruce Robinson is more or less taking the stance that Jack the Ripper, his suspect, Michael Maybrick, would have been trying to send specific messages to the police force and to people like Sir Charles Warren, leaving clues behind that a Freemason would recognize, but not necessarily being part of the royal conspiracy himself. At first, I thought the Masonic angle really did not have a lot of merit, and it's just going to be a wild conspiracy theory. And the parts about the royal family, I'm not completely sold on, but just looking at the possibility of there being some type of connection to the Freemasons, I get curious about that, and I think that that might actually have some merit and some type of value. I would disagree with somebody like John J. Edelston, who wrote Jack the Ripper, an encyclopedia, and just said flat out, zero, there is no connection to the Masonic issues. And we have Cat Daddy Steve here who says good morning. Hey, good morning to you too, Cat Daddy Steve. Cheers. But in terms of being a Jack the Ripper suspect, Francis Thompson would have been around 30 years old at the time, and he was born in 1859, and the Ripper crimes took place in 1888. That is age appropriate. But some other things about him, let's just go through some of this. Caucasian male, familiar with the area, but one person wrote this in the comments section. Even if you look at the thumbnail to this video, to this live stream, and you look at photos of Francis Thompson on Google Images, he had very wide protruding ears. And someone's just saying that that was not mentioned by anybody who even got a glimpse of the Ripper. They probably would have said something about those big ears. Now, we get this all the time in the Zodiac Killer mystery, but in the Ripper case, I don't even necessarily know if anybody has had a good enough look at the Ripper to say anything about his ears. But, I mean, is that sufficient enough to kind of give somebody a few points down the list? My biggest issue with looking at Francis Thompson as a Jack the Ripper suspect is this guy's been accused of a lot of crimes. It seemed like he was dealing with some intense mental health issues, or, yes, let's just call it mental health issues. I didn't say mental illnesses, because one thing that Dr. Todd Grande always reminds us is if we're dealing with a real person and just making assessments, we're not diagnosing anyone, only speculating on what could have happened. But it seems like he was dealing with some types of social issues and mental health issues. But did he kill anyone? And this comes up a lot with suspects in these high-profile serial killer murder mysteries. Are we actually accusing this guy of murdering anyone? But what it does appear to be happening is that Francis Thompson is someone who would go on to write poetry, and his poetry would be rather well received. Speaking is a lot harder than writing, I'll give you that one, Francis. And in terms of creating these things, he's talking about some very dark and twisted and morbid imagery in his poems. He's talking about how, like, let's just cite some of them: The Hound of Heaven, Nightmare of the Witch Babies, and he's talking about bad things that are happening to people, like the womb getting cut open, the stomach getting cut open, and the blood spilling out, and just laughing about it. Now that seems like it could be somewhat in line with the activities and thinking of Jack the Ripper. And I do have to admit that it is dark, it is twisted, and it is morbid, and it is very creative. And that's the whole point. When I read Francis Thompson's poetry, I think it's really good. A lot of people thought that it was really good. If it turned out that he was Jack the Ripper, I would never touch the stuff again, just be like, forget him. But as of now, just recognizing him as a literary figure, I think that he was really good at creating wordplay and sentences and imagery from poems. But that's not evidence that he killed anyone, because when we look at the creative process, I am always going to be on the side of the writers. Just because somebody can incorporate destructive imagery into their artistic creations does not mean they're actually dangerous. I'm sure Stephen King has included a few dark and twisted images in his novels, and I don't think he's ever killed anyone. And how about Thomas Harris, the guy that created Hannibal Lecter and The Silence of the Lambs and Red Dragon? Very dark and twisted stuff. I also don't believe that he has killed anyone. So just because somebody has a very intense imagination and a very intense capability to create things in an artistic tradition does not mean that they are going to do that in the external world, because somebody presented it to me this way. You can think about anything, you can daydream about anything, you can imagine anything, as long as you know how to differentiate between fantasy and reality, as long as you know how to differentiate between the barriers, what is acceptable in the external world versus what you're just thinking about and the abstractions in your own mind. Now, if somebody like Francis Thompson were indeed a schizophrenic or a psychopath or both, maybe there would be a few difficulties. And if he were a schizophrenic and a psychopath together, that would explain some things like the deranged form of Catholicism. That would explain some things like the awkward social conditions and living situation. That would explain his inability to form relationships, and that would also explain his very bizarre moments that are dealing with the internalization of rage and releasing them at specific times. But there is something that is discussed in the book, Jack the Ripper, The Works of Francis Thompson, and that is that serial killers begin with something called the aura phase. And the aura phase is when they start to think differently, especially somebody who is going to be an extreme introvert. Maybe they're a lone wolf type. Maybe they're somebody who doesn't have a lot of interactions, but they just begin to think in this way about how this could be justifiable. Committing destructive actions like murder might have some type of justification. And then they actually begin to sense things differently from the external world. And then they're like looking at colors indifferently. They perceive the colors in different ways. They perceive things with the five senses in different ways. And things about the way that they're just experiencing life begin to change. So somebody like Francis Thompson, if he were the Ripper, I think all of that would fall into place very nicely. But we have a comment here that's coming to us from William Kane, who says, was there another entrance exit to Miller's Court? Did he exit in the way that he entered Miller's Court? It simply fascinates me that the thought of him leaving the scene of the crime at whichever hour it was and just going about his business. So, as far as that, my honest answer, William Kane, is I don't know, but I believe so. I believe that there was, there were multiple entrances to Miller's Court. And this does become important because there was a witness to possibly seeing someone who was Jack the Ripper with Mary Kelly on the night of her murder, and that was George Hutchinson. And according to Hutchinson's testimony, he got a very good look at the man who was with Mary Kelly, and he provided a very strong description. And then he was waiting to see what happened because he knew Mary Kelly from previous involvement, and he waited outside for about 45 minutes, and that person didn't emerge. Now, it's possible that 45 minutes wasn't long enough. Some people believe that Jack the Ripper spent up to 2 hours with Mary Kelly because she was murdered indoors, and then he could have gone out a different entrance to Miller's Court. And as William Kane points out, it really is shocking that not only somebody is going to commit a murder and then just casually walk away, but the most vicious murder in the history of murder, and be able to just walk away at all. Because a lot of hypothesizing and theorizing and profiling relates to how people would have the person who committed the murder of Mary Kelly was probably losing control of their mental faculties, and they were just going to go absolutely berserk. Whereas somebody, let's say Francis Thompson, if he were Jack the Ripper, his life would have actually improved. And by the 1890s is when he starts to get recognition for being a writer. And then he writes this composition that is more or less a book review of one that was written by William Booth, who was the founder of the Salvation Army. And William Booth's book was called In Darkest England and Its Way Out. Don't quote me on that. In Darkest England and On the Way Out. Some variant of title like that. And Francis Thompson was actually more revered for his prose in his living years as opposed to his poetry, but he did write things down and he did mail things to people, and his poems were preserved, and quite a lot of them, actually. But his life really would have turned around. Now, how could this have happened? How could have he committed these insane mutilations of women during the Autumn of Terror and just then turned himself into a higher functioning citizen? This relates to something that we deal with in Unsolved Serial Killer Mysteries about how some people believe that the work was complete. That the serial killer did not have a desire to kill anymore because they had achieved their serial killer goal, as disgusting as it sounds. That, again, maybe Mary Kelly was the specific target. Maybe he was just releasing his rage on other women, and wrong place, wrong time. Something set him off, and that it was all about getting Mary Kelly. And once he actually murdered her, she received the full brunt of the force because he actually had a specific reason for targeting her. And then he didn't need to commit crimes anymore in his own twisted way. Or some people believe that serial killers might have a specific goal, and that is to commit crimes and prove they can commit crimes, and then to prove that they can do this without getting caught. And this comes up in the Zodiac Killer mystery a lot. Some people simply believe that the Zodiac Killer stopped committing crimes because he had proven that he could commit murder, and he had proven that he could get away with it. And these are the ideas of the psychological profiler Richard Walter. And with Jack the Ripper, though, there are similarities between the two. Perhaps he had proven to himself that he could commit crimes and get away with it, and the murder of Mary Kelly was so intense and so heinous that he didn't need to commit these crimes anymore. But I think that with the theory involving Francis Thompson, it almost certainly should connect to drug addiction. I mean, opium, but probably cocaine, because personally, if you were just to ask me my 2 cents on the subject, I would suspect that the Ripper would have been high on cocaine if he would have murdered Mary Kelly, because cocaine was widely used at the time. Even Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was writing about how Sherlock Holmes liked to get high on cocaine, the cocaine needle specifically. And that gives people energy. Some people get energy from it. Other people feel exactly the same. Other people are just a little bit numbed out. And I've never done this stuff myself. This is just what's reported to me and what I hear about in interviews. But I think the Ripper would have been high on drugs when he committed the murder of Mary Kelly. Maybe he waned off the drugs after that, if you're going to look at a suspect like Francis Thompson. But as this episode of Ripper Wednesday is winding down, I would like to turn it over to you guys. What do you think about Francis Thompson as a Jack the Ripper suspect? What do you think about the challenges that I have proposed about how I didn't completely comprehend about how this deeply religious man would have been offended by prostitution, would have been opposed to the Freemasons because of his religious beliefs, and then he turns around and goes on to be Jack the Ripper, the most vicious and bloodthirsty serial killer of all time. And what do you think about Francis Thompson matching the psychological profile and characteristics of Jack the Ripper? I would love to know. You can put your ideas in the comment section down below. What do you think about Jack the Ripper even being English? Because that's one we haven't really talked about too much. Some people insist that Jack the Ripper was of a foreign nationality or that he was Jewish. And as previously stated, Francis Thompson was a Catholic. What do you think about Francis Thompson's love affair with this unnamed woman, and about how that could have been a motivation for committing the murder? So I just really would like to know the responses to those challenge questions. And if you would like to read the book, it's called Jack the Ripper, The Works of Francis Thompson by Richard Patterson, and that is available on Amazon.com, and I'm sure you can get it in some other places. Overall, it's a very good read, and I think that it's going to be one that would be appreciated by people who want to know more than just, well, who was the killer? Who was Jack the Ripper? Give me your evidence. If you're looking for a book like that, I don't necessarily think that this one would be for you, because this one is really trying to tell the life story about how this guy, who goes on to become a recognized and well-received poet, could have also been Jack the Ripper. And just talking about all of these events from his life, about all of these things that he would have experienced that would have been elements of psychological turmoil. And to share some stuff from Simon Webb's book, Jack the Poet Was Francis Thompson, Jack the Ripper, he talks about how Francis Thompson excelled in school. He was a quiet and well-behaved pupil. As previously stated, he liked reading in the library by himself among his fort of books. However, he then would also deal with things once he became an adult about how his success in the classroom didn't translate to success in the workplace, and the people who would roll their sleeves up and get tough might have actually succeeded more than him, because they would have been more aggressive, they would have been more confrontational. And someone like Francis Thompson, who was most likely an extreme introvert, didn't necessarily care about that. He didn't even mind being homeless if it just meant that he could get lost in his own imagination. So, do you think that Jack the Ripper was somebody like Francis Thompson, a gifted underperformer with psychological issues? I think Francis Thompson would even agree to that. And someone who was deeply religious, exposed to stories of violence in the name of religion when he was growing up, who had, firstly, a playmate who goes on to become a Jack the Ripper suspect, who would have started fires as a kid, who would have been abusing dolls, who would have been dealing with the harsh poverty of Whitechapel. Do you think there's anything that rules him out? Please put your ideas in the comment section down below. I would love to read them, and maybe your comments will be worked into a future episode of Black Box Online Radio, and that will be all for me now. Anybody can write the show at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box, and there is always blackboxnid88 over on Instagram, and I'll see you over there. Until next time.